Amen.
Thank you. Like I said, chapter 46, before we get there, remember, I think it's been the past two classes, we have started this new section of Isaiah. In the historical outline, we're covering the Babylonian consideration. Now, Isaiah, remember, prophesied during the Assyrian power, and many years before the Babylonian captivity, and before Babylon ever even rose to the kind of power that is under consideration here, the world power empire that would take Judah into captivity. Isaiah prophesies about that. So I know that Harry, I wasn't able to listen to the classes, didn't have the time that I missed, but I know that Harry stressed, as he has been throughout Isaiah, that what God does by his foretelling of the future is prove his divinity. He's able to tell the past perfectly in its historical context, get all the facts straight. He's also able to tell the future, and everything comes to pass as he says it's going to come to pass. And so it is with Babylon, not just taking Judah captive, but rising to power in the first place. They exist, but they're not existing in this capacity to this point in time of history. But they will, because God says they will. And He'll use them just like He used Assyria. And He's going to use Medo-Persia just like He used Assyria and Babylon. And so in chapter 46, 47, and 48, we kind of reach the conclusion of the first third of this second half of Isaiah's prophecy, where we're going to see the idols of Babylon, especially in chapter 46, contrasted with the true God of the Israelites. And then in chapter 47, a prophecy concerning their downfall. We've already seen it a couple of times in the first half of Isaiah in regard to the section on the nations, and you'll see some similarities. Keep in mind, though, I'll stress this again, when we're reading the description of Babylon, even the names of their gods in verse 1, we're reading the description of her arrogance and her pride and her estimation of self that is extremely inflated, and the fact that she thought she was untouchable and powerful beyond measure, even putting herself on the same plane as deity. This kind of pride and arrogance that Isaiah gives detail about is a part of God's omniscience. The fact that He knows exactly how these people will be. He knows their tendencies. He knows their weaknesses. He knows their strengths. He knows why that they're going to come into power, because He's placing them there. And so all of this can kind of be lost in the details when we're studying something like this that has already happened, and we take for granted these things. But Isaiah is writing over 150 years before Babylonian captivity. So let's remember that as we study this section. The idols in God have been contrasted throughout this section of Scripture up to this point. And the challenge God has given up to this point has included this ability to tell the future and to tell it perfectly and to see that come to pass. That should be one of the most fundamental abilities of one who has created and is all-knowing, is to know the future. And yet it is profound that God can do it and they cannot. And that is something to keep in mind as we go through these chapters, because He's going to revisit that a time or two. And especially in chapter 48, He's going to stress that the Israelites, they should, by those past prophecies that have come into fruition, have trusted in God. And because they didn't, now they can be sure by these new things that are considered that these things will pass as well. It didn't have to be that way, though. So in chapter 46, God contrasts Himself with the idols of Babylon. He says in verse 1, Bel bows down, Nebo stoops. Their idols were on the beasts and on the cattle. Your carriages were heavily loaded, a burden to the weary beast. They stoop, they bow down together. They could not deliver the burden, but have themselves gone into captivity. So Bel and Nebo are Babylonian gods. It might just be an interesting side point that Nebo is part of the names of some of the kings of Babylon, like Nebuchadnezzar. There is a connection there with the gods that they serve. What do, though? These gods, keep in mind, this is the idea. They think their gods, their deities, what do? Stoop and bow down. What is that painting a picture of? Are they worshiping someone? Is that what's going on here? They're inferior. They're weak. And so you think of deity and you think of omnipotence, all powerful, the ability to help and aid and strengthen and protect the people that worship you and serve you, and the opposite is happening here. In fact, it says instead of them being able to deliver the people from that burden and oppression, they themselves are delivered into captivity. They're carried away, and you think of the burden that God lifts from us, which is what he's going to look to in the next couple of verses, and the idols themselves become a burden to these beasts that they are being taken away on into captivity. And so an impressive point that is made there. These idols are not true gods, and the fact that you've got to carry them shows that. The fact that they're being carried by people that don't serve them into captivity is a point that shows they are inferior. And so now he turns to the people that are to be serving him, Israel, and he says, "Listen to me, O house of Jacob, and all the remnant of the house of Israel who have been upheld by me from birth, who have been carried from the womb. Even to your old age I am he, and even to gray hairs I will carry you. I have made and I will bear, even I will carry and deliver you." He says in verse 5, "To whom will you liken me and make me equal and compare me that we should be alike?" One of the questions, really just an instruction, describe the contrast between God and the idols in chapter 46. What's probably the main one that we see here? From the things that we just read in verses 1 and 2 and what we just read concerning God with his people. God will sustain us. Who sustains? He sustains us. He's there always. He bears us. He carries us. What can be said in that context regarding the idols? Who sustains the idols? The people. The people made the idols. We'll see that in a second. And in fact, part of idolatry was thinking that the sacrifices offered these gods helped them to consist. It was their sustenance. And in Psalm 50, I believe that's part of the point where God is saying, "I'm not rebuking you for your sacrifices. I told you to offer them, but I'm rebuking you because you think I need these things. I've got the cattle on 1,000 hills. I've created these things. If I needed something, I don't have to ask you. It belongs to me. And so you offer these things with thanksgiving. You call upon me for mercy in your time of need." That's the idea. We need God. He doesn't need us. And the idols were those who needed the people in the sense that not they were true deities. They didn't actually exist. There's nothing behind that image. But the very existence of these idols is attributed to the imaginations of men. So he says, "Listen up, Israel. Don't forget that I've been bearing you. The reason you exist as a nation is because I willed it. I've been upholding you from the beginning. And when all this calamity comes upon you, don't you put your trust in idols. Put your trust in me. Continue to understand that I'm here to bear you, and I'm here to carry you. I'm here to deliver you." He speaks about it from their birth. In Exodus 19, you might remember the words of Moses, God speaking through him to the Israelites. He says, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob," God says to Moses, "and tell the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." So throughout your existence, I'm here to bear your burdens and carry you and bring you through and sustain you and protect you and give you victory. They needed to remember that now, and as we'll see in chapter 48, if they had only understood that the whole time, they wouldn't be in this predicament. But now you certainly don't put your trust in idols. Comments, questions on that? All right, he goes into some similar language to what has been covered in the text of the second half of Isaiah already in regard to how these idols have come into existence. In verse 6, it says that they lavish gold out of the bag, those who are idol worshippers, and weigh silver on the scales. They hire a goldsmith, and he makes it a god. They prostrate themselves. Yes, they worship. They bear it on the shoulder. They carry it and set it in its place, and it stands. From its place it shall not move, though one cries out to it, yet it cannot answer, nor save him out of his trouble. Look at the irony of idolatry. The reason that idol exists is because you took material that belonged to you, ultimately, that was created by the true God, but that belonged to you, and you scrambled to find enough gold and silver, and you hired someone who at times didn't even have any interest in this idol to make it for you, and then you bowed down to it. And not only did you do that, but when things got rough, you cried out to it for help. And you remember the scene at Mount Carmel when Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal, and he said, maybe he's asleep, maybe he's away. Cry to him louder. Cut yourselves, they did, and it didn't work at all. That's idolatry for you. And so don't go into this. It would almost be comical if it wasn't so serious that these people were actually doing this, and we need to remember that today as well. Covetousness is idolatry. All these things that we have, set up your future and security in your bank account, and make sure you prepare for retirement and all of these kinds of things, and it starts to become our object of worship if we're not careful. When that's something that is in our possession, we shouldn't be serving it. It should be something for our benefit that God has blessed us with, and we should be serving Him for the blessings that we've received. So remember those kinds of practical applications as well. Then he calls to their remembrance His greatness. He calls to their remembrance the things that He has done that demonstrate His divine nature. Remember this, verse 8, and show yourselves men. Recall to mind, you transgressors. I want to pause there. He says, show yourselves men. The New American Standard Bible says, remember this and be assured. Kyle and Delich comment on the language saying it means show yourselves firm. The idea of wisdom and manliness and security and firmness and this mindset of being resolute, it comes from considering the evidence. It doesn't come from our imagination. It doesn't come from our own will. When we're talking about being a man, being faithful, being strong, being firm, that's not going to come from trying to convince ourselves, make ourselves feelings arise that we are brave and we are good and we are stout. But it comes from the reasoning of God and His will. It comes from His message. It comes from knowing His past events. That's what faith is, and that's how we're going to be steadfast and stand firm. And it tells me that that idolatry really is childish. He says, you show yourselves men and remember what I have done, and stop fooling around with these things and trinkets and paganism. Remember the former things, he says, of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. What former things can you think of that He might be telling them to remember? Not a trick question. There's
power shown in the past all through their history.
Yeah. Look at the past. How many times in the Bible do we see that? Remember what God has accomplished, what He's done for you. Look at the power displayed. All these things are recorded so that we could learn about His provision and His power. So then he goes on to say, as he says, I'm God, there is none like me. And remember that as we will see, Babylon really claims the same thing. Declaring the end from the beginning in the ancient times, things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. A lot of those things that happened in the past that they would recall, they happened because what? God declared them, didn't He? He told them that this is what would happen, and this is what did happen. And so He's got the ability to tell of future events, and if that's His will, He does His good pleasure. Now He says in verse 11, calling a bird of prey from the east, the man who executes my counsel from a far country. Indeed, I have spoken it, I will bring it to pass. I have purposed it, I will also do it. Question number 3, who is the bird of prey from the east called to execute God's counsel? Yes? Okay, think of the language. A bird of prey from the east. You've got Babylon coming, and now you've got the prophecy of the future of something going to be done to Babylon to bring the people of God back. Who was from the east that he had prophesied about before? Cyrus, right? Cyrus from the east. He also mentions he's from the north, as Cyrus had conquered Media and brought them into that combining of Medo-Persia. And I think that's what he's referring to here, the bird of prey from the east. He's the one that God has chosen to do his will, to bring forth his good pleasure. And he says, you know what? It's going to happen because I purposed it. So he says in verse 12, listen to me. I want to make sure, okay. Listen to me, stubborn-hearted, who are far from righteousness. I bring my righteousness near. It shall not be far off. My salvation shall not linger. And I will place salvation in Zion for Israel, my glory. The whole reason that they're going through what they're going through is because they've been stubborn and disobedient to God. So they're far from righteousness. Now God's going to bring his righteousness near. The whole point of Isaiah has been that God is faithful. He wants his glory to be shown. He wants his name to be recognized and revered, and he wants people to be saved. Israel has been the one he's chosen to bring those blessings through. And so he's going to bring it about, and that's why he's going to deliver his people in the first place. He's going to bring near a situation where people who are not stubborn-hearted will be made righteous by his grace. He's going to do this, though, as we'll see in chapter 48, through disciplining the ones who have shown themselves to be stubborn-hearted, because though he brings his righteousness near, those who are stubborn will not be able to receive it. And there's got to be a submission to that. It's not going to be afar off. It will not linger. He will place his salvation in Zion for Israel, his glory. He calls Israel his glory. And in Ezekiel chapter 36, I see a parallel to this, where Israel's to be his glory, and people are, through looking at Israel in the way that they live, glorify God. They're representing who God is. They're to be holy as he is holy. But something has happened, and Israel, who is to be his glory, that was God's purpose, that was God's plan, is now causing his name to be profaned. In Ezekiel 36:23, he says then, I will sanctify my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, which you have profaned in their midst, and the nations shall know that I am the Lord, says the Lord God, when I am hallowed in you before their eyes. Israel is God's glory when Israel is submitting to his righteous ways, and he's going to bring that near. Any comments, questions on that? Yes?
Probably there is not only that, but then you have as well the Israel to come, the ultimate spiritual Israel. Physical Israel did at least stop idolatry when they came back from captivity, but they never were fully the ones that would show him forth, like he talks about the salvation in Zion.
He says, I refine you, but not as silver. Right. And in other words, you came back and you weren't as I wanted you to be. So that's definitely going to be fulfilled in the Israel that is spiritual, the true Israel. And when we see Zion, that's usually the case, as you see maybe talking about Jerusalem physically at times, and then a lot of times he's speaking of that to come. All right, chapter 47, he gets into the judgment against Babylon, some similar language that we've seen back in the judgment against the nations when Babylon is seen a couple of times. He gives some more detail, though. He calls her to sit in the dust, which shows this kind of grief and sorrow and humility. He calls her a virgin daughter of Babylon. Now, you might remember in chapter 38 when Judah, or rather, I think it was 37, when Judah is spared from that Assyrian advance, that the prophet says, this is what I'm saying to Assyria, the virgin daughter of Zion has despised you. I taught that, and what I mentioned back then, that he calls her a virgin daughter because all of these nations are being defiled by the Assyrians. She will not be defiled by you. And so when he talks about the virgin daughter of Babylon, her claim is that I'm pure, I'm untouched, I'm the lady of the nations, the lady of the kingdoms is what he's going to describe her as in a minute. But that's not going to last. Virgin daughter of Babylon, sit on the ground without a throne. Daughter of the Chaldeans, you shall no more be called tender and delicate. Likely referring to their living in luxury and profligacy. They would be those who are now slaves and servants, taking the millstones and grinding mill. They're doing that for someone else, not servants doing it for them. And remove your veil, take off the skirt, uncover the thigh, pass through the rivers. Your nakedness shall be uncovered. Your shame will be seen. It will take vengeance, and I will not arbitrate with a man. The New American Standard Bible says, I will not spare a man. The King James Version, I will not meet thee as a man. And the idea is that time is up. No more talking about this. You're taken. I'm not going to spare you. One of the questions is concerning the shame to be brought upon Babylon. What does God say will be uncovered? Nakedness, right? Now, of what does nakedness, according to this verse, consist? Exposing the thigh. And so there's some practical lessons for that there, and I think that we need to understand it in its context. When you think about a prideful, arrogant, powerful nation like Babylon, the way that God deemed appropriate to the horror that they would be exposed to the discipline and punishment that would be wrought on them, what he thought was fitting for that is, I'm going to lift your skirt, uncover the nakedness of your thigh, and expose your shame to the nations. That should tell us something, shouldn't it? It should tell us how serious we should take covering our nakedness according to God's standards. The world does not view that as shameful anymore. That doesn't mean it's not. And God's children who are trained in their consciences should understand the thrust of that here. Who's doing this, according to verse 4? It's like it drops a little reminder in there. Who's doing this? God is. Our Redeemer, the Lord of hosts is his name, the Holy One of Israel. And he elaborates on what he's calling Babylon to do, to sit in silence and to go into darkness. There's that idea of defeat and grief and despair, saying, you shall no longer be called the Lady of the Kingdoms. You are the preeminent one. You've got everyone under your thumb. You are the one that shines, but no longer. I was angry with my people, he says, and have profaned my inheritance, verse 6, and given them into your hand, but you showed them no mercy. On the elderly you laid your yoke very heavily. What does that tell us about how God disciplines his people, especially in these times of the nations? He's using an ungodly people, but does that ungodly people have any kind of accountability at all? Are they accountable to some standard? Yes. The Assyrians were brutal, and God used them, but they'd be judged for their brutality. No different from the Babylonians. And so I'm giving them over to you. I'm allowing this to happen. You're taking my people because I'm not pleased with my people anymore. But you took it too far. You were inhumane. You were extremely brutal. You showed them no mercy. So what? I will be, you said I will be a lady forever, that you did not take these things to heart nor remember the latter end of them. What is this that they did not take to heart? I'll be a lady forever. I'll be the lady of the kingdoms forever. No one's going to bring me down. But you didn't take something to heart. What do you think that is? What did he just talk about? God was the one who was actually behind it. And though you are a pagan nation, one that does not belong to God in this capacity, you're held to a standard as well. You forgot there's one who reigns, who gave gave Judah into your hands in the first place, and you're going to be accountable to him. You're going to be judged for the way you do this thing. And you forgot about that. You're not in control. You're not the one that's sovereign. God is. And you will answer to him for your deeds.
You go ahead over 100 years in time to Daniel, and you remember Nebuchadnezzar had to go and wander into the field, eat grass like a cow, his nails grew out, all of that, and God said the reason for it was until you learn that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men, gives it to whomsoever he will. That when any nation comes to a point that they think they are the power over God, God's going to bring them down and teach them who is the real power.
We would do well to remember that. Our nation is just like Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and Greece, and Rome, so on and so forth, a tool in God's hands. Me and JT talked about this not long ago after one of the classes. Tools are disposable. You can get rid of them. You can get a better one. You can just get rid of it because you're tired of it. And that's the way God deals in the kingdoms of men. He uses who he wants. And if he determines that's enough, then he'll get rid of them. Always remembering, though, there is a standard that we can live by. And he has promised blessings in living by a standard. So not get too caught up in some of the politics that are around, thinking that we are a nation that is above that rule. All right, verse 8. Hear this now, you who are given to pleasures, who dwell securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one else besides me. Remember what God said of himself in chapter 46 and verse 9? I am God, and there is no other. I am God, there is none like me. You see the point? Thought they were like God. Thought there was no one else like them. I shall not sit as a widow, is what Babylon says. Nor shall I know the loss of children. Using the feminine words, she is a nation, a lady of the nations, and I'm not ever going to experience this kind of sorrow, of weakness, of despondency, of helplessness. It's never going to happen to me. But when you think about becoming a widow or losing a child, does anyone know that's going to happen? How does that happen? We don't get warning about that. Any context of death you don't get warning about. Who has the power to say, I'm never going to become a widow or widower, I'm never going to lose a child? No one has any of that power. And so you kind of see the arrogance. Not only I'm never going to be in this weak and helpless and distraught position, but I've got control to prevent the uncontrollable. And so they're extremely arrogant. So he says, these two things that you just said you would never have to experience will come to you in a moment, in one day. Just like they come to anybody else, they're going to come to you. You're not going to have any control. You're not going to have any warning. The loss of children and widowhood, these shall come upon you in their fullness, commensurate with what you have done against God's people because of the multitude of your sorceries and the great abundance of your enchantments. In verse 9, when he mentions those sorceries and enchantments, and we'll see some of their pagan practices later, what does that tell you about how God used the religion separate and apart from what he has dictated? Does he care? Is it just kind of over there and he's ignoring it? It brings about his wrath, doesn't it?
Fault, he despises it, and it shows you a difference because all of these enchantments and everything, it said they were able to tell the future.
Yeah.
But he says you can't even tell you're going to be made a widow and childless in one day. I knew, but your enchantments didn't. They couldn't tell you anything or give you warning.
They're hijacking attributes of God. And not only that, they're stealing the attention and devotion that is supposed to be for him. They were created to serve someone, not these gods and in these ways. And so I think sometimes, at least speaking for myself, you get into this daily routine and this rut of thinking that, okay, we're doing it right, and all of these other religions, especially the far out ones, oh, it's just a joke, it's not a big deal, they're just out on their own. God looks on that and despises it as much as he does when someone takes his pattern in the scriptures and alters it to a degree. He hates everything. Everyone is amenable to this. There's no coexistence like we see with those who are liberally minded in our country today. He cares about all of those false religions, and he hates them with a vengeance. He wants the attention on himself in true worship. And so remember that, especially as we study the rest of this text. He says, you trusted in your wickedness, said, no one sees me. In your wisdom and your knowledge have warped you and have said in your heart, I am, and there is no one else besides me. And so their wickedness is including the deity that they claim to be. The fact that no one sees me is the idea that because I am and there is no one like me, I'm not amenable to anybody. I'm not accountable to anybody. I can do what I want, and nobody is going to hold me accountable. But he says, evil shall come upon you, shall not know where it arises, and trouble shall fall on you, will not be able to put it off, and your desolation shall come upon you suddenly when you shall not know. You're going to be judged. So what does he call them to do? Like your enchantments and your sorceries, we call them to do. Judgment's coming. Appeal to your gods. Appeal to your religion. You try to tell the future. You try to gaze into the stars and see what's going to happen and change it. You try all these occult practices, your sorceries that you've kept from your youth, and see if you'll be able to profit and prevail. Verse 12, he speaks of multitude of your counsels and the astrologers and the stargazers and monthly prognosticators. So all of these things that they can do, they claim that God can do, and telling future events, stand up and save you, see what shall become of you. And so he's kind of mocking them, isn't he? See if you really have any power whatsoever. He said in verse 10, your wisdom and your knowledge have warped you. When you give yourself over to this kind of stuff, any kind of stuff opposed to God's will and His wisdom, you think that that's going to be beneficial. God will give you over to that. Kind of said in chapter 19 and in other places as well with Egypt in chapter 19 that He, gave them that spirit of stupor and confusion among them. He just gave them over to what they wanted to do, and they consulted their magicians and all these kinds of things, and so He gives them over to their wisdom, and that's going to cause a problem. You'll be warped by it. It's not going to save you. It's not going to help at all. Yes, sir.
Modern day astrology goes on its practice of going back to this very thing from Babylon. And it's a joke in one of two ways, as you said, but also an affront to God. You look at your typical astrological sign forecast for the day, good may happen to you today, but also bad's possible. Well, when is that not so?
Yeah.
But then when it tries to get specific, then it's seen very clearly as being false in its claim. So you look at these things, and historically they've been shown that, but some are still depending on it today.
Yeah. When God tells the future events, He gives details, names, well before the person's born. He basically digs a hole for Himself if He's not really God, but He is. And so He's just confident in these things. He knows that they're going to happen, and that's what they're trying to do. And they say, could happen, it's good, like Harry said, maybe bad. So there's your fortune cookie for the day. Take that for what you will. That's about how serious these things are. They don't have this ability. And so he describes that in verse 14. They, all these people, your counselors, the astrologers, stargazers, prognosticators, so on and so forth, will be as stubble. The fire shall burn them. They shall not deliver themselves from the power of the flame. It shall not be a coal to be warmed by, nor a fire to sit before. So it's not just going to be some heat. It's going to be so intense, you don't want to be near it. And so I'm not sure exactly if this is what he's saying, but you might go to them for this kind of comfort and warmth and assurance. But this is going to be a consuming fire. It's not going to be for warmth. They're going to be burned up. They shall be to you with whom you have labored, your merchants from your youth. They shall wander each one to his quarter. No one shall save you. So not only these religious leaders of paganism, but all those you traded with and did business with, you may turn to them and they're not going to help you either. Any comments or questions on chapter 47 or 46? Yes.
Reminds me of a proverb. A proverb says, when your calamity comes. It doesn't say if your calamity comes, but when it comes, you will not have the wisdom to deal with it.
Yeah.
Because you have not practiced God's word, acknowledge Him as God.
Yes, ma'am.
Then your calamity, we all face calamity. But the wisdom, the commitment to God is what changes it.
Right, that's a great point. They're going to be suffering evil and calamity because of all that they've done, and God is saying it's going to happen no matter what. But it's going to happen to us no matter what too, because time and chance happen to them all. Bad things happen, and the way that we're prepared for that is God's wisdom. When you make sure that we're prepared before it comes, that's what prepared means, and you make sure that in chapter 45 it says that it's God who creates peace in calamity. He's bringing this on them, and especially because they're opposed to Him, they have no chance. This is going to happen. Anything else? All right, chapter 48, he addresses Israel again, and I think a great lesson that we can take from this, if we don't take anything else, is that God has gone out of His way to gain your trust and to instill confidence in you, and this is happening, but it didn't have to. You should have just listened. You should have figured this out. He calls Jacob, who are called by the name of Israel, who have come forth from the well springs of Judah, that they call on the name of the Lord, make mention of His name. but not in truth and righteousness. They call themselves after the holy city and lean on the God of Israel. The Lord of hosts is his name. Maybe make a side note of Jeremiah chapter 7 and read some of that chapter. That's kind of the idea where they're going and committing all kind of abominations and looking after other gods, and they'll come back to the temple and worship God and say, I'm delivered to do all these abominations. This is the idea. That's their empty formalism that he's looked at time and time again throughout this section of Scripture. And so because you have been unfaithful in that regard, he says, I've declared the former things from the beginning. They went forth from my mouth, and I caused them to hear it. Suddenly I did them, and they came to pass. Because I knew that you were obstinate, and your neck was an iron sinew, and your brow bronze. I knew you'd be stubborn. You turned to these idols, so I declared all these things that you can look back on. You know, in chapter 46, he says, remember this and recall to mind the former things of old. Those things that have happened in your history, I declared them before they happened, so that when they happen, you don't say our idols told us that this would happen. Verse 5. Glory goes to God. But then he mentions in verse 6, see all this you have heard, and will you not declare it? You should have, after seeing this, declared the Lord's name to others, shown your faith in him. But then he says, I have made you hear new things from this time, even hidden things, and you did not know them. And the reason he says that they're created now and not in the beginning, so you couldn't say, of course I knew them, like with the idols of verse 5, the idols told me. He says, though, the former things, verse 3, and these new things of verse 6, what might those new things be? What new things have we read about in this second half of the epistle, of the prophecy, especially?
Cyrus, Stephen, deliver, all those specifics.
Yeah. All these specific details about, Medo-Persia and Cyrus, one from the east and the north, and all of these kinds of things that have been prophesied, he's telling them now so that they can't say when it comes to pass that I knew them, and they couldn't have possibly known them. Verse 8, because you didn't hear and you didn't know, you were hard-headed, and long ago your ear was not open. I think maybe this also indicates the things that are going to come from their deliverance by the hand of Cyrus back to their land, and they would be fruitful again, and eventually the Messiah would come through them. These things that we're talking about in these sections, especially starting in chapter 49 about the servant who is the Messiah. These new things he prophesied, you did not know them, and surely you couldn't have, because only I know them. It says, for my name's sake I will defer my anger. It says, I've refined you, but not as silver. And we talked about that a second ago, that they would come back and not be totally pure. But he does it for his own sake, for his own name's sake. For how should my name be profaned, and I will not give my glory to one another? Why weren't they just decimated? Because then the kingdoms would say, look at this nation who claim to have the one and only true God as their God, and they're not even a nation anymore. God's not going to let that happen. His name depends upon it. And so this is all for his glory, time and time again. He mentions in verses 12 and 13 his divine nature. He's the one that created. He's the one that did these things. And so you should have faith in him, and you should realize that these things indeed will come to pass. He calls people to an assembly to hear, and who among them has declared these things? The Lord loves him. Who might him be who is going to do his pleasure on Babylon? Cyrus, right? How does he love him? Remember in Romans 9, quoting from Malachi 1, Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated. Did he love Jacob and not Esau? What was the point? 2 nations are in your womb. He's choosing Jacob, not Esau. He doesn't love Cyrus because Cyrus is a faithful, righteous man. He's saying that I've chosen him to do my will, and his arm shall be against the Chaldeans. I have spoken this, and so it's going to prosper. So he says, come near to me in verse 16. He says, I have not spoken in secret from the beginning, from the time that it was. I was there, and now the Lord God, his Spirit, have sent me. And so this is one of those verses that's naughty, and it can be difficult. We don't have time to go into all the details. It could be Isaiah that is saying, God commissioned me with this message, and you need to listen to it because it's from me. But also something that seems to be the case there, especially when we get to chapter 49 and the Messiah, the servant is speaking. It could be the servant there, and he was sent by the Lord, and he was sent, the Spirit was sent as well. Sorry we didn't get through this, but in verses 17 through the end of the chapter, he's essentially saying, if you just listened to me, you would have had these blessings. It didn't have to be this way. but you're in captivity. However, for my name's sake, verses 9 through 11, and verses 20, 21, you are going to rejoice coming back from captivity and be restored to your land. But there's no peace for the wicked. And so when you come back, blessings aren't going to be bestowed upon you if you continue in your unfaithfulness. And that would eventually happen with them who killed the Messiah. All right, thank you for your kind attention. We'll pick up in chapter 49, Lord.